Hey David, I'm making this video as a video response to a question. David was concerned about noise issues. He's building an amp. So, um, with the shielded cable thing, um, with an amp, there isn't that much gain. When you're running into noise issues is with overdrives and distortions, especially in these high gain pedals. That input wire is like an antenna. So it's important that you use a shielded cable, but you only ground one end of that wire, just so that for some reason that's how that works. Whatever comes in on that line, because it's just physically at that point of where the variable board ends, that wire going to the input jack is like a antenna that's picking stuff up. So in that case, how you do it is you have that shielding going around it, but it's only grounded in one spot, and that way whatever comes in will go to the ground, and it won't make it in to hit that wire that's hooked up to the super high gain amp. To answer your question, we never had any problems with any of the home built stuff, and some of it I didn't even use coax on. Now, when I say coax, I'm not talking about what I normally call coax, is what you screw into a cable TV, like a cable TV cable that has a thick, solid core inner conductor or stinger, and the RJ, what do you call that? Cable, cable TV cable, not that. I like to use old RCA cables. You can always pick those up for like $1 a piece at the resale store. Now, some stuff's better than others. Like this wire here is, I use this sometime. This is for headphones, so it's 1/8 inch. Some of this stuff, like the earbud stuff, when you open it up, it's single strand and it doesn't have plastic on it. It's got a like painted on, almost like magnet wire, and that stuff's kind of difficult to solder. I like to use whatever I can work with as far as cutting it, stripping it, and then especially what's important to me is the insulative property. Like I like to have coax that fully kind of is all the way wrapped around that stinger. I've seen some that's kind of halfway, like a ribbon wrapped around it, and there's a gap in there. But it's not anything that I really, I can kind of know when I cut the wire, and I'll warm it up with a lighter, and then I'll use a fresh razor and really carefully remove that, or a one-handed wire stripper, clicky clacky one, to help me safely remove the shielding from the wire. And with coax, you got to remove the outer sheath and the inner sheath. So what I look for is something like a 22 gauge inner core of stranded copper, and then a nice healthy outer. And what I try to do is keep the exposed stingers short, but I don't go crazy about that. It's amazing what you can get away with. That it's because the amount of gain that's on this amp is not that much. It's a line level amp. So the signal that's coming out is already really strong. So it's like it's not strong enough to really pick up any interference. And then another thing with noise is what's called star grounding, where you do all your grounds to one point. Another thing is a chassis ground, is using a metal cabinet. Or if it's not metal, you can buy slug tape or installative tape, and make sure that that's grounded by running a ground wire to a compression fitting, or soldering a spade connector onto it and running a screw through it, or soldering onto it. There's all kinds of different ways to do it, but you really would be surprised what you're going to be able to get away with because it's not a high gain situation. The noise comes into play when it's high gain, and this is not high gain. So the reason I don't use guitar cable is because it's harder to work with and it's larger and thicker and it's just unnecessary. I like cutting up RCA cables for this, old RCA cables. Cut the end off of one, strip it, and see what I got, and at that point I'll know. Can I work with it? Is it easy to work with? I always test everything, make sure that there isn't a break in the wire. That's another thing, is using a multimeter on a continuity test. My theory is whenever there is an issue, it's because I didn't test something when I had an opportunity to test it. So if you go along and you test your work with every step, then you're not going to have any surprises when you hit the power switch, you know. Now, we did run into, in the early days, heterodyne oscillation, which is when you have two devices that have a clock. Each device would have a clock, like a multi-effector, and then this Class D amp. The Class D amp does have a clock. And I found if I had a battery pack and I was running the amp off of that battery pack, I would always want to run the pedal off of it too, because it's a big battery pack. Why worry about a 9 volt when I got this big thing? So I would cut in a 7809 voltage regulator with a couple capacitors for filtering on it, and I would get this like this annoying, it's not interference, it's a clock noise. You'll hear ticking or a high-pitched whine. You'll know when you got a heterodyne oscillation. And the thing with that, like I had built them and we were out in the field, and I'm like, what are we going to do? We got this horrible noise coming out of the 1 amp. And I thought, oh, we unplugged the power cables and flip-flopped them. Meaning I had my daughter's amp was here and my wife's amp was here. And my wife's multi-effector was heterodyning. So we had my daughter's amp with the 9 volt output jack on it, powering my wife's multi-effect pedal. And then my wife's amp powered my daughter's. And that was only one day when we went out. I hadn't fully tested everything. You know, I got 9 volts out of it. It worked. That's all I needed to know. And we wrapped the amp up and it was done. And then when we got out in the field and hooked everything up, we had that ring ding 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 heterodyne. So with that, you just have to have another power supply. You could try, you know, playing around with filtering and multiple voltage regulators, or, you know, whatever. I don't think you're going to run into that, and that's only with DC. Like if you're running a computer that's an AC power supply, and then you've got a DC, AC to DC transformer. You should have that AC to DC transformer that's powering the amp just dedicated just for the amp. If you're going to need additional circuitry in there, you're going to have another DC power source. You're not going to want to tap off of that DC that's powering your amp. You can try. You might be able to get away with it, but I was always taking that voltage, whatever it was, and dropping it down to 9 or 5 and running it other places and using it. So yeah, you can run into that heterodyne. That's what you got to watch out for. But really, just, you know, you're getting a little bit concerned because I'm talking about that noise, which we really run into that more with pedals when there's high gain stuff. But with the amp, it's just like a line level signal that's coming through. It's already really loud, so there isn't much. You know, and I even didn't even use coax before and built amps that were perfectly quiet because the chassis was shielded. So I wouldn't concern yourself with it too much. Just use whatever your signal path is, however you hook it up, if you can, shorter runs is always good. Keeping the input cables away from any AC or even DC is important. Sometimes there's things with a layout where if you can do a dry run of it before you drill everything in there, to make sure that there isn't something you just need to move something, you know. But unless I was there and saw a drawing of what you were actually going to do, and like I said, as far as I know, you're building it's going to be a computer that's feeding to a Class D amp that's going to some speakers. And in that case, if you can isolate the Class D amp, put it in a Hammond box or whatever you can throw together. But I don't think you'll have to worry about it. I never did. I think I did in one amp. I used some sheet metal from a CD burner as a cage once. But in a larger, like wooden, like it was a speaker cabinet, and then I screwed that. It had a couple of 2x4s with a piece of plywood on top of it, so there was a little gap in there, and I wanted it shielded. So sometimes I would use old bits of sheet metal, and put stuff in boxes, or I would there was a stereo booster in that one, and that lived in a Hammond box, a pedal box that was screwed into the top of this PA speaker, is what it was, with the lid on it. That's how I started doing this. But we never had any. I don't tolerate noise. Believe me, I wouldn't have done it. And that was one of the things that I loved about the Class D stuff, because when I was working with the other, like when I started out, and I was hacking together amps and using like LM386, there's a lot of noise with that. All those designs are noisy. But the Class D stuff is super quiet. You should have no problem. Anyway, I hope that was helpful. Peace.